Hello, you're listening to the Public Rail Now podcast. I'm your host, Adam Barrington. On this episode, I talk with Tommy Carden, Director for UE's Research and Education Fund and Coordinator for the Green Locomotive Project. We discuss connecting labor and environmental justice, creating green union jobs, and much more. For more information about UE and the Green Locomotive Project, please visit ueunion.org. For more information about the campaign for public rail, please visit publicrailnow.org. Thanks for listening and enjoy.
I came to UE from Warehouse Workers for Justice. So before I started on staff with UE, I worked with Warehouse Workers for Justice for about 4 years. It's actually a worker center that UE founded back in about 15 years ago now. Sort of set up the worker center to organize logistics workers and warehouse workers just outside of Chicago, in one of the busiest, high-trafficked logistics hubs in the country. So I was doing that work for a while, and not only were we focused on how workers were being treated and on the shop floors in the warehouses, but Warehouse Workers for Justice was also focused on sort of the impacts of the warehousing industry on communities in Northeast Illinois more broadly, and did some environmental justice work at the organization. And when UE, was launching a little bit after they launched their Green Locomotive Project, I got involved and came on staff full-time last October.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah. And so brought you on to talk about not only, UE is, I'm a huge fan of UE. For those who are listening who don't know, UE, United Electrical Workers, the acronym's longer, but I'll just say United
Electrical Radio and Machine Workers of America for extra credit.
There you go. Yeah. Has been an impressive union since it was founded in the 1930s. And I'll get to that later on in our discussion. But the Green Locomotive Project is something that UE members kicked off. So what's the Green Locomotive Project? And what conditions led UE members to launch the Green Locomotive Project, and what are some of the primary goals of the campaign?
Yeah, great questions. So really the Green Locomotive Project, and I'll talk about the goals as we go here, but it really it resulted from conversations across the membership. So UE represents thousands of workers in the rail industry. So within our membership, we have members who manufacture locomotives and parts. And we also have rail crew drivers who are members of UE who work in rail yards across the country. They're driving and picking up crews and driving cross country, working across 18 states. So through the Green Locomotive Project, we've been pushing for the adoption of low to zero emissions locomotives across the freight transportation system. And, if this happens, right, the widespread adoption of green technology that exists right now, it'll cut pollution, it'll improve public health, it'll clean up, conditions in these yards where we have members working, and it's going to create more green jobs right here in the United States. So a little bit more about the two groups of members that I just kind of mentioned there. In Erie, Pennsylvania, there's UE Local 506. And 506 has nearly 2,000 members. This local is very old. It was founded just a year after UE, the national union, was founded. So 506 has been around since 1937. And for decades, workers there worked for General Electric, manufacturing freight locomotives. And in 2019, a company called Wabtec, the Westinghouse Air Brake Technologies Corporation, acquired GE Transportation. So members who are working in Erie for Wabtec, they're manufacturing locomotives. These members, they see opportunities for a different path here. One where, we could create more good union jobs that improve air quality, particularly like I mentioned in rail yards where, these dirty locomotives are, sit and idle for hours on end. The technology already exists, right, to run these cleaner engines. And for 506, they're the premier locomotive manufacturers in the United States, right? They can produce more locomotives right now, right? These facilities in Erie, they have the capacity to be producing many, many more locomotives, cleaner locomotives, right? If the railroads and Wabtec, right, were similarly committed. For decades, right, communities like Erie, and this is not unique to Erie, right? This is kind of a story of America, have seen a lot of manufacturing jobs leave. It's been hit hard in recent years, right, by job losses from deindustrialization, these, bullshit free trade deals, and even, the transition away from fossil fuels. So UE really, through this project, we really believe that workers in communities that suffer job loss because of large scale transitions deserve a just transition. And, we gotta push for investment in green manufacturing in places like Erie and communities like it across the US. One more point on that, and I'll talk about the rail crew drivers, but we actually did a study a few years ago just looked at, okay, look, if the manufacturing plants in Erie, the Wabtec facilities, if they were producing lower emissions or zero emissions locomotives, these green locomotives, how many jobs could be created, right? And, it was somewhere between, depending on what manufacturing occurred, 2,500 to 4,000, quality family supporting jobs, right? So the guys in Erie really, see this as an opportunity to both clean up the environment and, increase the number of jobs that they have in Erie. On Halcon, so these are the rail crew driver members, and they're working across 18 states in this country. And like I said, right, they're working around these locomotives day in and day out. And when you have these older locomotives that are in many cases, 20, 30 years old, these locomotives emit more pollution and they're idling for really long periods of time. So we got members, right, sitting in their vans, dropping off, waiting to pick up rail crews who are forced to breathe these dangerous levels of toxic fumes in, right, every day. And we know a lot of these yards, right, they're located near low-income, communities of color, where a lot of these drivers themselves live. So this pollution is not only affecting them on the job, right? Not only is it a real job quality issue, but it's also affecting their friends, their families, their neighbors at home, right? A couple other things that I'm sure a lot of your audience is already familiar with, but this diesel exhaust, why is this so serious, right? This exhaust contains fine particulate matter, and it's so small, right? It gets lodged in people's lungs, and it contains more than 40 known, cancer-causing compounds. So, exposure to these diesel-powered locomotives, especially the oldest and the dirtiest of them, it's been linked to, tens of thousands of premature deaths, low birth rates, premature birth, stroke, heart failure, heart disease, asthma, right? Children living near the rail yards have twice the incidence of asthma. And I can go on, right? But these are sort of some of the conditions that the Halcon rail crew driver members are facing day in and day out in the yards. So like I said, right, we're trying to create good union jobs here, right? Manufacturing low to zero emissions locomotives. We want to address climate change in the process and really clean up pollution, especially in some of these really high polluted rail yards. And we've been bringing workers and different locals across UE together around this, for close to 2 years now. We've also been working really closely with environmental justice organizations, which I'll talk more about. But really the 5 main goals here, what we're after, is one, we got to push the Class 1 railroads to adopt this new technology, right? And your audience will be no strangers to how willing the Class 1 railroads are to do anything, right? That's in anyone's interest, right? Other than the interest of their bottom line. But when it comes to the technology these railroads, are using, when you look at the numbers, it's staggering. Nearly half of the 25,000 freight locomotives that the Class 1s operate, nearly half of these 25,000 were built before 2000, right? So these are almost 30-year-old locomotives, about half of them, right? And they're among the dirtiest. There is newish technology that exists, right? Tier 4 locomotives. These are hybrids. There's still some diesel emissions, but it's about 15 to 90% lower in emissions, right? than certainly than the oldest models. And adopting Tier 4 and adopting even lower and zero emissions locomotives would cut pollution from the Class 1s very, very significantly. So we've been trying to push the railroads to adopt new technology is one goal, right? The second goal here is we got to push producers, right? Companies like Wabtec to invest more in this clean technology. Wabtec loves to call itself, a leader in rail decarbonization, right? They're always saying this in their investors reports and, in their shareholder meetings. But what they're really doing is they're greenwashing, right? They're saying one thing and they're doing another. They're saying they're a leader in rail decarbonization, but they're failing to significantly invest in the production of this clean technology in places like Erie, right? They're leaving opportunities on the table to both be the true leader of rail decarbonization they claim, and they're failing to create many, many more good, solid union jobs in the process. Third, Adam, we really need regulatory changes, right? And we've been pushing over the past couple of years for regulatory changes at the federal level. The stuff I was talking about earlier with the EPA and the tier system they have for locomotives, we got to fix that because there's a lot of loopholes in the current regulations that allow for the oldest and dirtiest locomotives to continue operating, right, cross country and continue operating in rail yards across the country as well. So we're pushing for regulatory changes. Fourth, we're pushing for state and local action, right? There's actually stuff that states and local governments can do to pursue, a just transition, in a limited way, right? And we're working with our environmental justice allies now more than ever to think through and plan some action at state and local levels, especially given the pretty dire situation at the federal level. And then fifth, we're constantly looking to grow and strengthen our coalition that's working with us around our Green Locomotive Project. We're continuing to build with other unions, environmental justice organizations, community organizations. We all have an interest in this, right? We all have an interest in a cleaner planet. We all have an interest in good, clean jobs, green jobs in our communities. We saw under the Biden administration, we got as close as we ever have, right, to making some of these federal changes that were needed, but it wasn't enough, right? So we're really focused on how we can build now with our allies to get some wins here and pursue some campaigns for action at the state and local level, but also set ourselves up to have a stronger fighting coalition when the political climate changes and we're able to once again make these changes that are so desperately needed federally.
Yeah, and listening to you talk about these goals and all these different factors in like the cost in public health, like how it's impacting workers, it's impacting communities by the track sides, and like it actually reminds me. I was talking to Nick Wurst. Shout out to Nick Wurst of Railroad Workers United over the weekend at the strike conference, and he reminded me something that we talk about pretty often in the campaign is that even as far back as the 1910s, it was pretty clear that something like full rail electrification and it was a matter. It's a matter of will, not of money. The money's there, so right. It's like and as you're talking about the jobs that could be created, how, the detrimental impacts to people's health would be there would not be these horrible hazards like that, people breathing in fumes and everything that you just mentioned. But it's thinking about all this. It's like, where's the downside? Who is saying, actually, we could do all that, but it's too expensive, or I'm just curious about what kind of arguments you might have heard, or some other organizers with UE might have heard in your organizing that people would say, well, that all sounds good, but we can't do it for XYZ reasons. Like, what excuses are you hearing?
Yeah, I mean, it's looking back at the history, right, which you probably know better than I do on this. I think you see all the missed opportunities we've had as a country, right, to make these changes, right, and to electrify, right, and to make these big bold changes a lot earlier in our history, right, And I think the arguments that were made and have been made are the arguments that are still being made, right? It's too expensive, right? Producers like Wabtec will say, we'd love to do this, but nobody's ordering the technology. Which some truth in that, right? If the railroads aren't compelled to adopt this new technology, right? Companies can produce a lot, but they're not going to get out on the tracks. But expense is one thing. I think a lot of people think it's just it's pie in the sky, right? It's not possible. It's not realistic. So a big part of what we're trying to do is we're working with members and others to really have these conversations all across UE, and talk about what is possible, right? And you're right, this is possible, and it should have been done a long time ago. And we got to continue to push and fight to make this happen as soon as we can.
Definitely. Yeah. And you mentioned earlier building a coalition, connecting labor and environmental justice activists, folks in trackside communities. So I'm interested to hear what kind of tactics or talking points or conversations, what has been useful in building that coalition, and whether it's getting their fellow workers on board or engaging with folks in the community or environmental justice organizations. That's imperative across the board in terms of labor, because there's this still mythical, weird idea that labor and environmental justice don't have anything in common, right? Or they're on separate poles or something, and it's just ridiculous. So yeah, what have those conversations looked like, and what's been useful in terms of strategy and tactics in approaching something like building a coalition?
Yeah. I'd say that one thing that I think kind of situates UE to, pretty well, right, to do this work is that, we've built, we've built relationships and worked with other organizations, right, sort of outside unions for decades, right? We've made common cause with environmental justice organizations, other social justice organizations, right, pushing for progressive changes that we know affect, right, the lives of workers in many ways, right? So UE is no stranger to building and pursuing relationships with environmental justice organizations. But I think for decades, though, right, that sort of there's been an assumption that groups, unions, workers, and environmental justice organizations just speak different languages, right? And to some extent, I think there hasn't been as much engagement as there should be, right? So I think there's misunderstandings, there's different assumptions that are made, kind of not knowing where people are at. And I think the only way you break through that, the only way you actually kind of get to the heart of that is by talking and actually building and engaging and showing up for each other, right? So first, maybe let's talk about kind of how members have been talking about the project with members, and then I'll go into how members are talking with environmental justice allies. But I think one of the things that members started to talk about kind of early on in this project is, look, these goals are not pie in the sky, right? Kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier. These are real. This stuff is possible, and it's connected to it's connected to our jobs. It's connected to our job quality. It's connected to how these companies relate to our communities. And we found, right, that member-to-member conversations around this stuff are the best, right, the most effective. So one of the things that comes up a lot in conversations is, look, we can create more jobs and leave behind a better world for our kids, right? Both are possible. You can do both at the same time. Really, for rail crew drivers, right, this stuff is a really immediate job quality issue, right? These yards are dirty. They're breathing in these fumes. It's affecting them, their coworkers, and their families. So really talking about these issues here as a real immediate job quality issue. It's affecting them and their communities, right? And this is something that their employer, Halcon, and then the big boss, the Class 1 railroads. It's a choice they're making, right? It's a choice they're making to pollute these yards, and we can fix it. We have a lot of members who have been engaged around the project too, Adam, who don't work in the rail industry, right? Who work in some of UE's other sectors. Maybe it's public sector workers, right? Maybe it's workers who are part of the big grad worker, organizing wave. We have a lot of grad members who are involved who, don't work in a rail industry, but they really see the urgency of this moment and have spent a lot of time, engaging with and working with folks who are involved in the environmental justice movement. So we're trying to find out how we bring them in, right? And kind of use some of their expertise and find ways to really engage them in the project too, and find ways to involve other members who don't just work in the rail industry too. So really with that, right, with members and then with environmental justice allies, like there's no substitute for actually just sitting down and talking with one another about these issues and what needs to change and how we get there. I want to give you a success story, if I can, about members working with environmental justice allies. So there was this big effort in California through the California Air Resources Board. You might remember this, Adam. They were trying to pass this in-use locomotive regulation the end of last year. And if this were to have gone forward, it would have been huge because California would have applied for a waiver, which they did through the US EPA, to directly take on the issue of locomotive pollution. And if EPA were to have granted that waiver, it would have given the green light for states across the country to pass similar regulations, just the way that environmental law works, the Clean Air Act works. So passing this was really important. And the environmental justice allies that have been working on this for a long, long time, they called on UE and they said, we really need you guys to come out and support, right? So we talked to members about this. We had staff and members, driving around rail yards across the Western states, talking to members about this for a few months. And we got a number of members who came out and actually testified at the CARB hearing. We were one of the only unions to testify in support of this, of the regulation. I think we were the only union to actually show up in support of it, if I'm not mistaken, with significant numbers. And I think this showed the environmental justice allies that, members are personally engaged in this, right? Members really have a stake in this and want to fight to clean up their yards. And after that, we had environmental justice allies coming to members, rail crew drivers who they hadn't talked with before in person and saying, hey, how can we support you guys in your fights? How can we support you when you're fighting Halcon, when you're fighting the railroads? All these fights are linked and we have to fight together. So, in my book, that was a real success story, and it really illustrates, some concrete, collaboration between members and EJ allies. And I think we're only seeing really the start of that kind of collaboration and solidarity. And we're going to need a lot more of it over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, that's beautiful. It's like hearing that really just, yeah, for sure. And like you were saying, I mean, there really is no substitute for that one-on-one conversation. I think that's like something that organizers in labor and in any other, whether they're in environmental justice or community organizing, any type of organizing, those one-on-one conversations can really make or break a campaign or an organizing drive. So definitely, yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up.
I think too, I don't want to just, I don't want to paint too, I don't want to oversimplify, right? In just saying, conversations can kind of see us through all the complexity here, right? Because we know that when we're talking about a just transition, a transition is going to be messy, right? And there's going to be a lot of difficult conversations that need to be had over, how do we get there? What does a transition look like? Workers who are currently doing this, what kind of new jobs are going to replace that? And how are we going to make sure everyone has the training they need, the support they need, the kind of working conditions they deserve, right? And I think, there's going to be some tough, messy conversations on the road towards a just transition, right? And I think we need to be having these conversations now, but also we need to have these relationships in order to have those conversations, right? Because if we don't have these relationships and we're not working together and fighting together and getting to know each other and understanding where kind of both sides, if you want to call them sides, are coming from, I think there's no substitute for this. So just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, and that's actually a great segue into the next question that I had, which is, given that the Green Locomotive Project has been around for a while, and I mean, like you had mentioned, UE has done a fantastic job, just building those kinds of relationships in the community and with other organizations that, I mean, really, the whole labor movement needs to kind of take a page out of that book. But what kinds of maybe bumps in the road have there been? Any kind of like learning experiences? Maybe something didn't work and y'all had to go about it in a different way. Any kinds of experiences like that would be great to hear about as well.
I think right now we're kind of in a bit of a bump in the road, right? Obviously. I mean, I'm thinking of some of the challenges we have before us, kind of without probably being able to make some of these federal changes we're going to need to make over the next couple of years, right? So much of kind of what we've been doing, right? It's not just been policy, right? We're very focused on organizing and working with members to really like lead on this project. But there's certainly big federal changes that need to happen in order to kind of change the regulatory environment to force the railroads to adopt this new technology. So, right now we're really spending a lot of time working with our allies to think through how do we pivot a little bit, right? How do we move towards taking some actions at the state level, at state levels, right? Even local levels, to advance, the goals of kind of a lot of our projects that, a lot of goals in common. And where can we really fight and where can we apply pressure to really move the needle here in a way that both is going to, get some wins here in the next couple of years, but also, like I said before, really set us up for bigger, bolder success when the political environment changes.
Yeah, we kind of have touched on this, but there are plenty of people that think, oh well, like I was saying earlier, this sounds good, but it's pie in the sky. And I mean, as we're public rail now, we're talking about nationalizing the U.S. freight rail system, so I'm all too familiar with those kinds of criticisms.
Sure.
Like, yeah, it sounds good, but how are you going to do it, type of thing. So I was wondering, like, have you or any of your fellow organizers or UE members encountered that kind of pessimism, and how do you go about confronting that and addressing it, and reassuring people that no, this isn't pie in the sky, these are tangible things that we can do? Just interested to hear, because that's like I said, in terms of public rail, that's something that we encounter quite a bit as well.
Yeah, I think there's a difference, and I think it's good to point this difference out. Is there's a difference between pie in the sky and being bold, right? But both of our projects, if I can speak, on behalf of your project, both of our projects are bold, right? But they're not pie in the sky, right? They're not impossible. We have a lot of work cut out, right, for us to get there. For the Green Locomotive Project, right? Like, in order to compel these railroads, like I continually say here, right, there's got to be big regulatory changes. We're going to need robust public investment, right? We're going to need these companies to invest as well at levels they're not planning on investing in, right? If we're talking about electrification, right? It's going to cost a lot of money to build out, electrical infrastructure, to build out the grid. And what do we have in this current moment, right? We have cuts to EPA, right? We have rolling back of environmental laws. I just saw yesterday, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health was just cut, right? They're coming after the NLRB, right? This might be the most dangerous moment for workers in, maybe in our country's history, maybe in decades, right? When you talk about encountering pessimism, sure, right? I mean, there is some pessimism. And I think we're talking with people about, these challenges are really great, but we can't back down, right? Even thinking about, right, the unprecedented attacks on federal workers, right? They're stripping collective bargaining rights away from, hundreds of thousands of federal workers, way worse, right, than what happened with PACO workers in the Reagan era. Within UE, right, we're seeing attacks on our grad worker members, right? Suppression of free speech, detention of members without due process, right? Especially leaders who've spoken out against injustice, including the U.S.'s role in the genocide in Gaza. The list goes on and on, right? I mean, there's a lot of challenges before us. I mean, did this work get easier because of all these changes? No, right? Did this work get less urgent? Also, no, right? Will our fights look a little different now with kind of with all the additional fronts we're being forced to fight on? Absolutely, right? But I think it's having the hard conversations, talking with members about the issues they're still facing, and in many ways, these issues are getting worse, Adam. Right? Like the yards aren't getting less polluted, right? It's not like WowTech is investing in more, green jobs now. So, we have our work cut out for us. But I think it's kind of making sure we're talking with members about their vision here and what's at stake, right, if we don't fight for these things.
Yeah, well said. Absolutely. And UE is known as this, it's a democratic with a small d, and member-driven union. And since the 30s, when UE first was founded, it has been at the forefront of the progressive wing of the labor movement, has always been ambitious and, like you were saying, bold, and connecting with communities and thinking beyond sort of the bread and butter issues of, usual trade unionism and all that. So just in general, like, what do you think the labor philosophy of UE can teach the labor movement as a whole? What can workers and other unions do to bring that member-driven, rank-and-file, democratic unionism into their own labor circles and into their own unions?
Yeah, great question. There's probably others in UE who are a lot better situated to answer that, but I'll give my attempt. I mean, I don't know if I said this explicitly off the bat, but I'm really proud to work for such a bold rank and file union like UE with such a rich history, right? And within UE, we talk about our 5 core principles. So aggressive struggle, rank and file control, right? The democratic small d sort of structure that you mentioned. 3, political independence. 4, international solidarity, and 5, uniting all workers. These are really the guiding principles, the guiding lights for UE that we've really stuck to since we were founded in 1936. In practice, right, what does it mean to be a rank and file union? It means members run this union, right? And UE has stood in stark contrast to this prevailing culture of business unionism in the United States. One of the ways kind of that it relates to our project here is, the democratic structure, right? Every convention, right? Members, they vote on UE policy, right? They set the policy for the union. And the last convention and previous conventions, members have voted on and passed policies related to the Green Locomotive Project, right? The last convention, the Green New Deal. There's a resolution passed on sort of UE's commitment to the Green New Deal and to pursuing a just transition, right? This is official union policy that members have voted on, and now is sort of a mandate, right, for everybody who works on staff, at the union. But I think going to maybe the aggressive struggle, core principle here. If you look throughout its history and into the present here, Adam, right, UE, they know how to fight, right? And we've been fighting the boss. We've been fighting corporate greed. We've been fighting the corrupt, union of state and corporate power since our founding, right? As far as lessons, I mean, I guess all I can offer here is it's really not enough for us in this moment to be on the defense, right? We can't just pick up the scraps after Elon Musk and Trump and their enablers and cronies are done. We have to be thinking about how we're fighting right now, right? And going on offense, engaging in aggressive struggle, and fighting for the future that that workers need. And that's going to require, right, union members, organizations across the country to mobilize in ways we haven't seen in decades, I think. And I think that UE can offer an example, right, for how to fight and how to win. And then the last thing I'll say on this is, I think another lesson, right, is like the kinds of coalitions we're going to need to win in this moment, right? UE's long made common cause with, like I said, folks who are fighting for social justice and, even outside the traditional trade union movement, right? Environmental justice allies. And, we got to continue to embrace and build with our allies, continue to build out these alliances in this critical moment, because it's going to, we always say there's a lot of us and very few of them, but, we gotta come together, and we're going to have to fight in ways we haven't fought before in this moment.
Absolutely. And before I let you go, where can listeners go to learn more about the Green Locomotive Project and UE? And in what ways are you looking for folks to get involved?
Absolutely. So we have a page on the UE website that's dedicated to the Green Locomotive Project. So I'd encourage folks to sign up there. They'll get occasional updates on what we're doing, occasional calls to action, coming through that. It's a good way to kind of stay up to date on what we're doing with the Green Locomotive Project. I would also encourage people to reach out to me, and I could send you my contact information to send out to people if they'd like to get involved. I mean, we're always looking to talk to new folks who are interested in finding out if their organization could work with us. If you see something that we're doing, that you're doing or want to be doing, we need to continue to build out our coalition and, work with new groups and, get new ideas. And so would love to work with anybody and talk to anybody who's interested in finding ways they, as an individual or, as a member of an organization, can join us here and build for the fight ahead. And if I can say a word on my closing word on also our kind of UE's, standing with, Public Rail Now and the RWU, and back in January 2023, UE's, general executive board, right, made up of local leaders from across the union. They all kind of endorsed a statement, right, calling for public ownership, of the railroads. We always see how, when these railroads are going to be run and operated, by the kind of, greedy bosses that have always owned and operated them. That's also a real, right, obstacle, right, to us winning the things we need. So, that's another kind of example of something that we've been standing with you all, and are looking forward to continuing to work here in this fight ahead.
And we very much appreciate it. And it speaks volumes that UE would be. And to be fair, we were like, well, they're badasses, so of course they're gonna be on our team in terms of like nationalization of rail. But we appreciate it nonetheless. And again, UE is incredible. The work that you're doing is imperative. And I look forward to working with you more. And again, highly encourage our listeners to check out UE and check out the Green Locomotive Project. Get involved. If you're interested in organizing your workplace, I can't think of a better union really to get in touch with that will, put the membership first. And so Tommy, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it, and I look forward to talking with you again sometime soon.
Likewise. Thanks, Adam.
Yep.